Hey everyone. So I'm back to the are these metal thinking today. And really where I'm kind of thinking today is, where metal truly is metal. Like we all know that Black Sabbath was the original metal band. If anybody band is going to be the original metal band, it's Black Sabbath. Although myself personally, I would argue that Iron Butterfly was metal before Black Sabbath was. All you have to do is listen to, you got the title track, or not the title track, you got their major hit, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. On the same album as In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, you got the song Are You Happy? You got Iron Butterfly theme off of their first self-titled album, you get an Iron Butterfly, and I've covered every Iron Butterfly album, so, check those out. Because Iron Butterfly, if you love metal, especially early metal, Iron Butterfly is a spot to go. And, I've covered everything Black Sabbath at this point, so, check all that out as well. But then, Led Zeppelin, through their own choice, chooses not to be metal. They like to be associated just with hard rock. That's okay. Rock, hard rock, that works for me. No problem there. There's definitely heavy metal elements in there. But if they personally don't wish to be associated with metal, and unfortunately I can understand why with some of the metal bands that I've discussed, I get it. And then you got Deep Purple. Interesting term I heard coined for Deep Purple is Camaro rock. And it was the guys in Priestess, actually, that called Deep Purple Camaro rock. And that feels really appropriate. And even when you're listening to songs like Highway Star, Space Truckin', Smoke on the Water, well, there is that undeniably heavy presence in there. Not metal. Definitely heavy, but not metal, I'm fine with saying that they're proto metal or hard rock, Same as with Zeppelin. Zeppelin and Deep Purple I kind of put in the same category that way. And then, you got some other bands that were out there early enough that theoretically could be slightly associated with, but not really. Alice Cooper, I've never read any of the articles that it was in or whatever, but, apparently in the early days around the Love It to Death release or so, there was articles out there that referred to Alice Cooper as being metal. Now, back then, Alice definitely was not heavy metal. Even the heaviest of Alice Cooper back in the early 70s, I could never put into a heavy metal category. Just doesn't have that. It has the aggression. It definitely has, everything that I could attribute to punk rock, hard rock, sure, but not metal. Jimi Hendrix, definitely proto-metal. You can hear the birth of that shrapnel guitar in there, but Hendrix himself, not metal, The Doors, not metal, Obviously, the Beach Boys, not metal. A lot of people will say that the Beatles' Helter Skelter was one of the first heavy metal songs. And while I can understand, based off the distortion, why they believe that, no. Surf rock, oh, I love me surf rock. And let me tell you, man, surf rock and metal, distortion is the only difference. Seriously. There's lots of examples on YouTube of this. Go check them out everywhere, man. You take the distortion off of black metal, you end up with surf rock. But does that make surf rock metal? Nah, it makes surf rock. It just makes it proto-metal, Origins. And, the more and more I think about this, it's like, realistically, truly, the only two bands that I 100% consider honestly metal in the 70s would be Black Sabbath and Iron Butterfly. Now, that being said, Iron Butterfly only released 2 albums in the 70s, I think. And it's their Sun and Steel album that is totally metal. Totally metal. Like, big time swords and sorcery kind of metal-ish, you know, going into that inspiration for the European metal, or the, you know, symphonic metal, stuff like that, big giant storylines and whatnot. It's a beautiful album. But when I think of other bands from, like, that would have started in the 60s, went into the 70s, I really don't, oh, there's my alarm. I really don't have any outside of Iron Butterfly and Black Sabbath. There are other bands I know that have been thrown in that category, but they don't belong in there, you know? Like I said, Alice Cooper in the 70s, no, definitely not. I mean, people like to put Zeppelin in that category, and for reasons I can understand, but at the end of the day, Zeppelin was more rock than metal, definitely. And I would say the same thing about Deep Purple, you know, which I've already said. You know, and when we get to bands that, you know, weren't around in the 60s, but were around in the 70s, I still wouldn't put Kiss in that metal category, you know. There's really... Jethro Tull I couldn't put in that category either. I know they won a metal Grammy, but, you know, honestly, like, truly looking at it, I know there were definitely some fringe bands, because Iron Butterfly would technically be classified as a fringe band. Yes, they were popular. Yes, people know them. However, that being said, they're not, you know, they're more on the fringe, you know. But true metal, like true metal that was going and strong and lasted, I think Black Sabbath was like the only one really out of the 70s that really, like, was mainstream and deserves that title. Because, I mean, AC/DC started to blow up, but they weren't metal. I mean, AC/DC definitely released one album only that could be classified as metal. And even then, you know. And then, when you really, if you look at it that way, you know, like, you had a couple fringe bands, you had Black Sabbath, and then you get to the 80s, I'm going to say, you know, like, realistically, the 80s is what truly gave birth to metal as we know it now. Like, yeah, Black Sabbath started everything. I mean, like, if you look at Paranoid, speed metal. Okay, let's just use the Paranoid album, okay? In that Paranoid album, you're going to find speed metal. You're going to find arguably some thrash metal, definitely some doom metal. What else? You know, stoner metal, power metal. It's all there. Black Sabbath did it all, okay? But every genre afterwards, like the actual splits into the genres, like when Black Sabbath did it all, they did it all under the title of heavy metal. But then you get the birth of thrash, glam. I'm using glam loosely. You know, we can say LA metal scene if you like instead of glam. Because Wasp being LA metal, but they're not really glam, but they were glam, you know, it's kind of a thing, you know. And then you got, you know, going into that, you got those divisions there. Like, you know, Wasp definitely has a metal side to them. Motley Crue definitely had a metal side to them. Motley Crue, as you go through their catalog, feels more and more kind of hard rock and less metal, you know. And that's while they were still in the 80s. You get into other 80s bands as well that came out in that time period, you know. same thing happens. Like, what is it? Twisted Sister gets thrown into that glam metal category a lot, and realistically, they were just glam rock as far as I'm concerned. There was nothing really truly metal about Twisted Sister. Maybe their look, I guess, but that's about it. What else is there? You know, AC/DC in the 80s, definitely heavy, really hard and heavy, but took until the 90s before he got Razor's Edge, which is the only album from them I would ever classify as metal. And it did get them put in the metal category. You know, Alice in the 80s, he definitely went metal. Alice, without a doubt, in the 80s went metal. But that took until the 80s and the later half of the 80s before he went metal. You know? And you know, you got your Megadeth out there, which I've talked about before, you know, Slayer, Anthrax, Metallica. And those all came out of thrash, but obviously, like, Metallica went outside of the thrash category for sure. You can only do so much with thrash. I'm sorry, folks. I know there are thrash metal folks out there that love their thrash, but there is only so much you can do with thrash, and you got to go out of the thrash category, because if you're doing thrash, you can't get the heavy, and I'll take the heavy every day. You know, going with other metal stuff that goes with that, though, you know, you've got... No, I go with the big four for thrash a lot, and then you get into the other metal, you know, doom metal, not really a thing. Like, then you get into the 90s where you start getting more metal. Like, okay, so you had heavy metal, then you get your thrash metal, and it starts splitting up a little bit, and shock rock adds to it. But shock rock wasn't metal to start with, and it just... Okay, so, yeah. This is just kind of where I'm at today on this whole thinking about the early genesis of metal. Now, I'm sure there are one or two bands I might be overlooking from the early days. Like Rush, someone might say Rush. Rush, I don't think Rush has ever released a metal album. They've released some very heavy albums, but I want to say maybe the Counterparts album, maybe. I don't know, maybe the Roll the Bones album, maybe. I don't know. They were heavy, but I still can't call them metal, you know. And I love Rush, you know, just thing in the 80s, you know, just, and their 80s, Rush's 80s period, definitely nowhere near metal. Who else out of the, you know, the 70s there even, you know, like there's, when I'm going back thinking of all the major bands, I can think, you know, Aerosmith definitely was just rock, you know. Van Halen theoretically could be kind of lumped into the metal category a little bit. And I've discussed that when I've talked about Van Halen on their albums. You know, you can see how the first Van Halen album definitely inspired stuff. And then there was the third album, I think it was the third album, which name I cannot remember off the top of my head. That one suffered from not knowing whether it wanted to be a metal album or a hard rock album. You know, there's definitely some stuff out there. I don't know. It's just when you really sit here and you think about it. In the comments, tell me if there are other bands from the late 60s, early 70s that were truly true blue metal. Not proto metal. True blue metal, like Black Sabbath, you know? And not bands that later became metal, like Alice or Kiss, because, you know, the Revenge album, I will give it definitely a metal-y sound. It definitely had that glam metal kind of attitude in there, but it was a heavier, darker kind of glam metal, which was kind of cool. I don't know. So tell me what you think, folks, in the comments down below. What bands am I not being fair to from the 70s that should be classified as metal? Not just proto-metal, but truly metal. Even the 80s. You know, like, I'm going to have to get into that. I'm going to have to put together a giant list of bands and go through metal, not metal. Comments. Just let's start building that list. Who's metal, who's not metal? All right, folks. I gotta wrap this one up here. I rambled. Drop me a line down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button, subscribe button, bell for notifications as well. A couple links worth checking out. Otherwise, folks, peace, love,